So we have with us David Pettit. So David Pettit is the head of sustainability at Nomad Foods. We have Matt Juden-Bloomfield, who's the head of sustainability at Lidl. And we have Lee Shepard, who's the director of corporate affairs, policy and sustainability at Apetito Group. So thank you so much for joining us today. And what we're going to be discussing and kind of dialoguing about is how do you discuss and build buy-in with your CFO and C-suite around your sustainability initiatives. So how do you pivot the conversation from climate risk as a compliance topic to a driver for value creation and growth for your business, and building the buy-in across the business to achieve that. So we're going to start with a quick Slido question. Has everybody used Slido in the past? So if you can scan the QRC code. So the question is, which statement best describes how your company views climate risk? And there's 4 options. Does your business view this purely as a compliance and reporting exercise, a reactive operational issue? They're moving spaces, so I'm not going to read them because they're jumping around, but we can track them as we come in. So
Good on it.
All right. So the leading one is interconnected with other risk categories, geopolitical risk, enterprise risk, etc. And I think this matches what Dan was talking about kind of in his opening statement, that climate risk cannot be completely disconnected from other risks that the business is facing. And this is important for sustainability managers and leaders to understand, because it's the intersection of those risks that compounds the risk for the business, but also potentially leaves climate and nature as a value driver and an opportunity to mitigate some of the other risks that might be impacting a given business. So super interesting. Okay, so the first session we're going to go into is the impact of geopolitical developments and market conditions. So kind of zooming out on the broader question of how businesses are navigating this. So between inflation, volatility, energy costs, and supply chain disruptions, there's a lot of headwinds facing businesses and food and beverage companies as well. So how are you positioning climate and sustainability as a solution to these specific challenges rather than just another competing priority? So I'm going to start with you, Matt. Any thoughts on that? How are you positioning climate and sustainability as a solution?
So you probably know we're a discount retailer, and so driving efficiency is absolutely at the core of our business model. Driving efficiency means wherever we can, we're optimizing to reduce any wastage. And so inherently, the sort of Lidl business model is actually pretty sustainable. But I think there are 3 kind of core components that we see. So sustainability helps us to reduce volatility. So for example, where we've invested in renewables since 2018, we have now a PPA for 100 gigawatts of offshore wind, and that provides all of our energy needs for our warehouses for the next 5 years. That reduces our volatility in terms of we've locked in a price for that energy usage for a period of time. So that's great. The other is kind of our overall exposure. So the Lidl policy in every market that we operate in, which is now 32 countries, is that domestic supply is the absolute focus. So in GB, 65% of our range is sourced from Britain, and that means 100% of our beef, 100% of our eggs, milk, butter, poultry are all British source. Many other retailers can't claim that, but by sourcing from GB, we are then minimizing our exposure to sort of supply chain risks outside of the country. So that really helps. And then that ties into the cost base, right? So by us optimizing, like I mentioned, and reducing efficiencies, increasing efficiencies, we can keep our costs as low as possible. So we, on average, have about 2,500 SKUs in our stores. Tesco maybe has 30 to 40,000 SKUs in a store. And so, again, we're slightly less exposed when it comes to price. But what it does mean is for those lines, we can lock it in with a longer term contract for our suppliers and ensure that we're keeping the price as low as possible.
Okay. So when I think about time horizons, so some of the acute risks that businesses are facing today, are on a much shorter time scale than some of the sustainability initiatives I imagine are necessary to put in place for long-term goals and value creation. How are you navigating those different time horizons with some of the acute pressures that businesses are facing and maybe the priorities of the board and senior leaders in your business? So maybe we'll start with you, David.
Not an easy task, I must say. You know, when we look at food and beverage companies currently, they've got huge headwinds. You know, you see the cost of inflation hitting the supply chain and the bottom line. You've then got the battle branded players have with private label taking share, which means we have a pressure on the top line. Yet we need to maintain a specific margin to continue to invest in the brand, which as a private label player, you don't necessarily need to do. So that's the sort of headwind that we're currently facing, coupled with then undervaluation of the stock prices of many food and beverage companies. And you see more recently Warren Buffett, you know, removing or reducing significantly his stake in food and beverage companies, including Coca-Cola, which made him extremely wealthy. So that's the sort of wider sort of context a CFO is currently facing. And then comes me talking around, if we want a business in 10, 15 years time, we need to focus on, you know, adapting and mitigating climate change. It's a difficult sort of circle to square within the current context that he's operating in. So the way in which I try to sort of do it is sort of say, right, we need to have a range of interventions across multiple time horizons. There's obviously short-term interventions, to Matt's point, that one can take now, which is very much supporting the cost agenda, driving efficiency, reducing waste. And that's sort of activities with maybe a 0 to 2 year payback. These are things you can drive quick wins and the CFO will get behind. But at the same time, we need to say, well, we also need to at least start dabbling on the more medium to long-term time horizons, because the more transformational activities required to really build resilience in the business takes time. And it's not something you can quickly pull when you need to. So that's, you know, focusing more on the medium term. So, you know, 2 to 5 years, looking at transitioning from renewable energy purchasing through buying certificates, which you can just do on a market, to locking in 10-year VPPAs, which drives that long-term stability in energy pricing. But that has to be a medium-term intervention, because you're not sort of commodity trading on the peaks and the troughs of the energy market. So some years you win, some years you lose. So that's the sort of medium-term return that we sort of drive. And then finally, you've got the long-term pieces. So that's looking at, you know, what is the future operating environment for food, looking at the policy environment, the consumer environment, and what does that mean in terms of our business operations and our innovation pipeline, and what we source where and how that needs to start evolving to thrive within that new environment. So that's, you know, the transition to healthier and more sustainable products, lower carbon meat, or lower carbon diets rather, not meat. So the transition potentially from red meat to white meat to blue protein, hopefully, and more to veg. What does that mean in the landscape of GLP-1s, and how does that then shape your business strategy moving forward? But again, all of these things need to happen concurrently with investment for the medium and long-term interventions ramping up, maybe in a slightly longer time horizon.
So not an easy challenge.
No, certainly not. But
keep the attention
exactly
in the moment when other risks are pressing, but in order to prepare for the future, but keeping that narrative going. So I'll open it up to the group. How do you work across? So Dan talked a little bit about the need to work across divisions, across departments, and maybe this speaks to what you were talking about a little bit, David, as well, is to implement these changes, you're going to have to partner cross team, cross department. How do you guys navigate those discussions within your organizations? And is it easy to pull those narratives together? Are you seen as a help, a nag, a hindrance? How would you guys talk about that within your?
Shall I kick off?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So you probably never heard of Apetito. So very quickly, yeah, we're a ready meal manufacturer and supplier primarily to health and social care sector. So we would supply food to 70% of the UK Meals on Wheels market, probably supply about a third of the meals eaten in the NHS, 700 care homes, 700 schools. We're a privately owned business. So I come from a different context maybe to the other guys on the panel here. So one of the areas where I think we've had real value in driving engagement across the business is probably around business purpose, the why we do things. Most people in our business, we serve an awful lot of elderly, vulnerable people. So people get what we do. And I think for us, values are really important. And ethics and sustainability are one of our core values. I think it's something that we try and do all the time. We don't get it right all the time, but there's a real authenticity about it in our business. So I think we do really well to get buy-in from people throughout the business. And I think that purpose bit is really important for us. The other bit, I think, is that we always try and align that to what I would say creating competitive advantage. How can I stop being the evangelist in the room that walks into our businesses and says, right, I need you to decarbonize the food in your retail offering? You know, I don't want to be the person that's just nagging them all the time. So we'll look very much about our customers. So our biggest customer is the NHS. So we saw a number of years ago, we'd made a net zero commitment back in 2019. The NHS had published a green plan with their commitment to net zero, and it was pretty light on food. They talked an awful lot about food waste, but not actually about decarbonising their menus. So we went to them with a proposal for decarbonising NHS menus, and it was based on nudge theory, really, to start with. There really wasn't an appetite, if you pardon the pun, in the NHS. If you're recovering from an operation, your average length of stay in hospital is 3 days. So if you are a committed red meat eater and you love your steak pie and your beef casserole, you're probably not going to go plant-based for those 3 days. And I think we recognise that. So we did a lot of nudge theory around transitioning away from red meat to white meat. Yes, with a bit more fish and a few more plant-based dishes, but pretty small. And over the last 5 years, we've decarbonised the footprint of NHS menus by 20% with that. So I think aligning to sort of like creating competitive advantage in our business through partnering with our customers has been really key. So I think purpose gets people on board, and then how do we create competitive advantage? And that keeps the CFO on board as well.
So we're similar to you, actually. We're privately owned. We're the largest privately owned business out of Germany. I do actually think in some capacity, though, publicly listed businesses have it easier because you have the shareholders forcing action, but that's a whole other topic.
Maybe. But depends who the shareholders are.
True. I think you're right in the terms of the value point. So Lidl is very values led, and being a discount retailer, I think we really see our role as the fact that everyone has to eat. And so we show up with accessible food that is affordable to everyone. And the aim that we provide is that it's at the best possible price with the highest ethics and best sustainability, sourced from the best suppliers. What I think we hadn't really done a good job of is connecting the dots in terms of helping our colleagues to understand the sustainable impact that we were deriving or delivering out into the communities we served, and telling our customers the story of the fact that we source all of our meat, our poultry, etc., from Britain, that kind of thing. And so what we have done for the last year and a half is gone on that journey. So we've created across company governance. So we now have a steerco that has representation from every single part of the business that meets quarterly. Also created a quarterly board report, which basically is all of our public commitments that we have sort of put ourselves to. I've aligned them to each of our board directors. And so each of our board directors is accountable for a specific set of these KPIs. So for example, the COO is accountable for our reduction in food waste, or the chief customer officer is focused on our sort of transition to plant-based food, that kind of thing. And so every quarter they're then getting a progress report in terms of how that's moving. And at the steerco, their kind of -1s, -2s are then having the discussions around what could we be doing to sort of tactically move that. And then at the grassroots level, we've got our store colleagues engaged. So we created something called the Green Team. So the Green Team is basically a sustainability network that any colleague, be it in a store, warehouse, head office, whatever, can join, sharing ideas. And every single region has a Green Team lead. So basically they are their point person. It's completely voluntary. We've got 300 members so far, which I'm pretty proud of. It's the biggest company network so far. We have a podcast, so every month we put out like fun facts and stories, and it's 10 minutes, and it's literally me and someone else from the business just chatting. But we'll give them facts like, did you know that if you shut all of your blinds in your store tonight, you'd save the business £10,000? Or did you know if you turned off all the lights tonight, you'd save the business £16,000? Little nuggets that they can walk away with and go, oh, do you know what, I can do that. Or we then send out newsletters, and in the newsletters have a little what do you need to know, and one of the what you need to know points is always about food waste. So did you know that you can donate bread up to 10 days after its best before date? Little things like that that help sort of make some transitional shifts. So it's collaborative.
That's great. Anything else, David, you want to add? Nothing.
No.
Okay. Okay, we're going to pivot into our next Slido question, but super interesting initiatives. So next Slido question, if you want to pull out your phones. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how confident are you that your organization could successfully defend the ROI of a $10 million or pound climate adaptation project to your CFO tomorrow? So you have to walk in tomorrow to defend a large initiative. How confident would you be at this moment? Leaving the Risilience event at the Garden Museum in Lambeth.
I went slightly higher.
It's all anonymous. We won't know. All right. Anybody need more time? Great. Okay. So not super confident to slightly confident are winning out. And this is a hard challenge. And that's really the topic that we're here to discuss today is how do we build more confidence in our ability to drive clarity for our CFO office and ultimately get the funding needed to drive the initiatives forward that we all think are important for the business. So we're going to move into the next session, which is really how to build success with the CFO and other business functions. So tying climate risk directly up to board level governance can present challenges. How do you link climate risk directly to board level governance? How do you ensure that long-term resilience targets like SBTI or Scope 2 reduction goals are treated with the same fiduciary weight by executive leadership as short-term quarterly performance? And I'm going to start with Matt.
Well, I kind of answered it in that we have this quarterly governance. So that is our kind of core mechanism. What we're now starting to do is also build a, I suppose, a live like climate risk exposure figure. So we currently talk at our annual exposure of about $500 million, and $500 million accounts to our sort of overall net zero transition risk, our sort of risk of our portfolio, same of our supply chain risk, the potential green claims risk that we might have, our packaging taxes, etc. And but that's a static figure. We are sort of using a heavy amount of assumptions. And so Charlie and I are in the process of developing a more live document, which is where the Risilience tool will come in once we kind of get it fully operational, but helping the business to then sort of see where we're making tactical shifts. How does that figure inflate or deflate accordingly? And I think that will then become a really useful talking point.
Lee, so Apetito were early adopters of initiatives like SBTI. Can you give us an overview of how those decisions were taken?
So we made our first commitment back in 2019. And at that time, I had a CEO who was very passionate about this and was a big believer in that ability to create competitive advantage. So I can sit here and say, well, actually, go back to that point I made earlier about purpose and vision were really important in getting us on that journey. But what actually happened was that I took him for a meeting with the Carbon Trust to talk about science-based targets, which he'd never heard of. And we came out of that meeting and he said, should we go for a coffee? Which is always his means of telling me that, yeah, actually he's interested in something and he wants to talk about it. And he just sat there quietly for a moment. He said, we're going to do that. I said, well, just before we sign up for it, Paul, I said, let me just sort of paint some of the risks of not achieving it and the costs of achieving it. And he said, oh, don't worry about that. He said, the reality is customer behavior will change, legislation will change, policy will change, but we will create competitive advantage from this. So whilst I'd like to say there was a really strong business case for doing it, it was a decision made over a cappuccino in a London cafe. Based a lot on belief. Now, I mean, we're a privately owned business, so we've got family shareholders who definitely look towards the longer term. So it's easier to propose solutions that you can look at over a 20-year time horizon, I think, for us. So that was in our favour. But it was a decision made more on belief than it was on facts.
And Matt, you talked a little bit about this governance dashboard. What kind of metrics? So for years, the sustainability teams have talked on carbon metrics and scientific and climate related metrics. How do you translate those metrics into metrics that the CFO office and the finance office and the risk team can understand and engage with meaningfully? A little bit about SBTI. How do you translate those metrics into metrics that they understand?
So I suppose we're still on a journey with that. Like the coming up with that sort of loaded cost is the way I'm trying to translate it more for the CFO. We're still developing. I think the other thing that's been quite effective is that we use RepTrack as our sort of reputational, I suppose, gauge. And one of the metrics of that is citizenship. And so citizenship talks to our sustainability, our CSR, broader charity exposure. And that's done on a quarterly basis. And so that becomes quite an interesting benchmark for the business to see how that's kind of wavered up or down, and therefore why. And so we're able to then talk about, I suppose, the things that we've done under that in order to then help explain.
Does anyone on the panel get specific requests for, say, presents to your CFO office? What's the response back? Are there any metrics that you feel like they're really looking for that you have trouble producing or translating into? Any insights?
From my perspective, yes. You know, again, I think there is a difference between a privately owned business with longer time horizons, and in some cases maybe a little more purpose driven, and they want to pass it on to the next generation of their kids, family that will be living in the environment and world that they have established, versus a publicly listed company where the owners are a little more distant from a company and expect short-term returns to fill our pension pots. So the questions I normally get is very much around, you know, what is the impact on potential cost of goods coming through? What's the ultimate impact on EBITDA? Because ultimately, a lot of businesses, they're all very much focused on that. And that's the biggest challenge at the moment for sustainability professionals, is how do we move the narrative in the current world we're in from, you know, purpose and value is very important. That should always be there, but realizing the economic context we're in and actually starting to speak in a more commercially orientated way, and how we can put numbers to demonstrate that what we all inherently believe creates wider value in the long term and even the short and medium term in terms of competitive advantage, but how we can actually demonstrate that concretely in terms of impacts on financial metrics.
And Lee talked a little bit about competitive advantage, or a few times has mentioned this term competitive advantage. What does competitive advantage look like for Nomad Foods by way of implementing sustainability strategies? What would that look like?
So honestly, it is competitive advantage on many fronts. So the way in which I sort of frame it is sustainability supports in two key areas. One, builds supply chain resilience, which builds, reduces, to the point Matt covered earlier, reduces the risk to price volatility in the supply chain, lower exposure to price volatility, reduced impact of potential shocks, supply continuity, avoidance of supply disruption, and reputational benefits, versus then the sort of supporting commercial growth bit, the competitive advantage on that front, where we can differentiate our products to our customers and consumers to justify, in effect, why they should choose Bird's Eye or Aunt Bessie's. And it's how we can make sure our interventions across our value chain either support one or two of those sort of key areas. That's how we then deliver value and hopefully that competitive advantage.
Maybe while we're on it, would you like to list some of the main brands under Nomad Foods for the audience?
Sure. Does anyone know who Nomad Foods is? Well, the people who I've spoken to before, don't put your hands up. But people who I haven't, do you know who Nomad Foods are? Oh, okay. Well, that's surprising. So yeah, it's like Aunt Bessie's, Bird's Eye, Goodfellas in the UK, and then Igloo Findus across Europe. So Europe's largest frozen food company.
Okay, so maybe sticking with you, David. So how have you thought about sustainable financing options to secure capital for your initiatives? And are the options available currently sufficient to meet the need?
I'm going to be diplomatic here. I was less diplomatic on the call, but I see we've got cameras here, so I want to be. I need to be somewhat on the record. So we do use sustainable finance funding. We've got a sustainable linked business loan, which has 3 metrics currently on there, sustainability metrics. One is decarbonisation in support of our original 2021 SBTI target. Second is around packaging recyclability. And the third is around sustainable sourcing of our vegetables. And that's linked to that, then gives us a slightly preferential interest rate when it comes to our refinancing arrangement. Gaps within how best to frame this? So finance and the allocation of capital is absolutely critical to drive and support the transition that we lead across the food system, both in terms of our business, supporting farmers, to prevent costs just trickling right up or down the supply chain to the end consumer or to the farmer, where the whole thing just doesn't work. So there needs to be capital allocation across that and sustainable and incentives to do that. Sustainable finance products make sense, but in my view at the moment, there are a few key gaps. One, the interest rates are preferable, but not massively preferable. And when you're looking at some of the big CapEx intensive projects that are needed to deal with the hard to abate carbon elements, the ROI and the benefit isn't necessarily quite there yet. The second dimension is, at the moment, a lot of the funding is very much geared towards carbon, because the carbon market is a lot more mature. You can quite easily put a price of carbon and then sort of factor that in the markets. But when we look at F&B, most of the risks in the supply chain action now are nature and resiliency level risks. And I think there needs to be a little more time. And this is what I think the great work that you guys are doing about trying to put some valuation around it. There needs to be a maturing in that market so that there can be more financial products that factor that in. So I think, they're the sort of key gaps at the moment, and sort of more rewarding output and impact rather than, okay, you're having a target or something else in place. So what we are interested in exploring further beyond our sustainability linked business plans is, blended finance arrangements. So how do we partner more with retailers to potentially get a larger group of individuals and organizations that need capital to then get a better rate. We're also looking, and it's an emerging market, but given we're the world's second largest fish processor, we are looking at blue financing. So again, everything's been focused so much on carbon and sort of terrestrial funding, but there is this huge potential and growth in blue financing. But again, science needs to evolve in terms of marine ecosystems and what would constitute sustainable in that regard. So they're the sort of elements we are starting to explore as we move forward, but there are some key gaps, I think, in this space that need to be addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, at the other end of the value chain, there are pressures from customers to decarbonize. So there's the internal pressures, maybe coming from the business, and then there's the pressures that are coming from the customers. How are you managing this, and how does it differ from management of the upstream relations with agricultural suppliers? So Lee, you talked a little bit about your interactions with the NHS, and how are customer preferences driving some of the decisions that Apetito is making?
Yeah, so so Apetito is effectively split into two. We've got the B2B markets that I talked about earlier. That's about half the business. And then we have a direct-to-consumer retail brand called Wiltshire Farm Foods. And that's delivering directly into the homes of the elderly. Typical customer would be 83. So we've got two different aspects to our business. So there's quite a lot of demand pressure on the B2B side from the NHS. They've got their green plan. They want to decarbonise. Interestingly, all the language is about decarbonisation. It's purely focused on carbon in the sort of public sector space. So it's about kind of supporting that demand for it. And I talked about the model earlier of how we created the first reduced carbon menus in the NHS. So it's responding to their demand. In our consumer business in Wiltshire Farm Foods, I said we've got elderly customers. So it won't surprise any of you to hear that our top 5 selling meals for the last 20 years have been roast beef and Yorkshire pudding What's been number one? Cottage pie's up there, shepherd's pie's up there, Lancashire hot pot. So they eat a lot of red meat. So that poses us some challenges. And every time I go anywhere near the sort of trading team in Wiltshire Farm Foods, it's like, oh my God, here comes Lee again. He wants to talk to us about, lentil casserole. So there we've kind of gone with a different approach. So we've tried to create demand. We recognise that from surveys that we've done with that customer base, we know that they're not particularly passionate about sustainability. However, they are passionate about waste and they are passionate about recycling. So we introduced, for example, a closed loop recycling scheme for our ready meal trays. We think it's the only one in the world that runs on an industrial scale. So customers order meals from us, they wash the tray out, they give the tray back to the driver on the next visit, and we turn it back into a new tray. And we've recycled over 50 million of those. What we're trying to do with them around food is take a more cautious approach. So we trialed something, what became known as the green brochure. So Wiltshire Farm Foods customers still like a brochure in their hand. They like to go through it. They like to talk about the meals with the driver. So we send out millions of brochures a year. And the hierarchy of that brochure has been designed primarily around red meat because they're the most popular dishes. So we trialed a green brochure. So front cover has fish and chips on the front. Incredibly popular dish with the elderly, but it's not red meat. First section in the brochure, we now lead with poultry rather than beef. In terms of choice architecture in the brochure, the hero slots on double page spreads are no longer taken up by red meat products. They're white meat or fish. Menu packs have fewer red meat products, and so on and so on. And we ran a trial of that with about 10% of our network. The Wiltshire Farm team were petrified about it, that I was going to reduce sales and margin. And we ran that and we saw no reduction in order volumes, no reduction in margin, and a small reduction in carbon. So first trial went really well. We then ran a subsequent trial to 50% of our network. And we ran that over the winter. So I was a little bit concerned about, are we getting to when more of the red meat dishes will be preferred? And actually we saw exactly comparable results. So the concept of the green brochure now runs everywhere. That's just our standard brochure. So there's an element of sort of like satisfying demand. There's an element of trying to create demand or influence customers who are probably not quite there on the journey yet. I mean, it's only relatively small and we're going to need to do a lot more, but it's a really encouraging start.
So super fascinating, this idea of helping drive demand for things that are moving the needle. Very important. A lot of the vulnerabilities in this particular sector, food and beverage, are found at the farm level. So there's a hot word of regenerative agriculture. I'm just kind of curious on the panel here, how are you leveraging regenerative agriculture? How are you translating and quantifying the impact of regenerative agriculture practices with your suppliers? Is that something that you're seeing progress at scale? Any thoughts on that? I don't know, David, Matt, anything on regenerative agriculture?
Yeah, well, I'm going to caveat, we haven't got a solution yet. At the moment, our program is, our sustainable ag program is very much centered around TI platforms, farmer self-assessment, and nearly 100% of our veg sort of meets that criteria. And that looks at water, that looks at ecosystem health, that looks at energy, labor rights, etc. But if I'm honest, that approach, and this is why we're looking at how we evolve it, is a little of a tick box exercise that ensures a base level of sort of farming standard. Where we're going now is looking at, how do we transition to a more regenerative outcome focused approach, looking at soil health, water conservation, biodiversity, energy, and there's one final one I can't remember, sorry. So what we're actually doing at the moment is, partnering with some of our farmers across the UK, Germany, and Ireland to understand bottom up rather than a top down approach. What are the key risk and resiliency issues you're facing currently in your operation? Well, number one. Number two, what interventions are you already taking that address this and build resilience? That is farm profitability or soil health, etc. And then three, what are the interventions that you think you could take but can't? And why can't you take that? And we're using that bottom-up approach coupled with what the wider industry are doing, again, through SCI platform, and the regenerate together framework to sort of say, right, these are the similarities, and these are the areas that we really want to focus on and potentially explore how we address through capital allocation, either directly through us or through other means, in order to get the output in terms of outcome, in terms of improved soil health, etc., that will ultimately build resilience. So that's the journey we're currently on, and we'll hopefully have a view in the next sort of 12 months. Key to all of this, though, is metrics. Because again, it was difficult for us as a business to get our exec team to sign off for our updated SBTi net zero commitment last year. And the way in which I did that was very much through that financial lens, looking at climate financial risk assessments. And I looked at the carbon pricing risk and the need for us to invest to mitigate that. When we start to look at nature risk at the moment, again, to my earlier point around sort of capital markets, quantifying nature risk, and then quantify, if you were to do that intervention, that's how much that will mitigate that. And that's the ROI is still, I know you guys are working on it, but it's still early days and there needs to be a bit more of a leap of faith. So again, making sure that we develop the right metrics, understand the current baseline, and then looking at, potentially yield variability versus average, looking at input cost reduction, particularly at the moment due to rising fertilizer prices. If we reduce fertilizer application, you're supporting the financials of the farmer, and then understanding what that is from a business sense. So that's what we're working on, but we are yet to have a sort of a silver bullet that covers all of that.
We also don't have a silver bullet, but we are a food retailer, and so farming is obviously at the heart of what we do. And so we commit in a variety of different ways. So 100% of our fruit and veg is LEAF certified, and has been for a number of years now. So that kind of is the highest standard of certification for fruit, veg, plants, flowers. So by doing that, we're ensuring that we're only working with suppliers who are already adhering to the highest levels in terms of regen agrig. We've been the top selling fair trade cocoa supplier for the last couple of years as well. And again, that is sort of our investment in terms of ensuring that the cocoa providers are meeting the highest credentials. We've also got a sustainable beef program. So looking at some of our beef suppliers, particularly the largest ones, working with them and us kind of co-investing and helping them to decarbonize, identifying areas of operational waste and what we can do together. And the same is now happening across the dairy group as well. But kind of per the point, it's a harder topic, and we are still working. We've got a sort of an energy RFP that's currently in works, and the whole aim of that really is how do we look to sort of further support our scope 3 decarbonisation. It's 98% of our overall emissions, and so we know that there's more that we can do to help our farmers, our suppliers more broadly on that journey. We're just trying to work out in what is the best way to do that.
Mm. Okay, as we close out this section, we started this one on confidence levels going into our CFO office. Any hot tips for those in the audience of ways to drive engagement and build buy-in with CFOs? What are the tricks of the trade you've used and employed to date?
I'd maybe invite us to talk about CXO rather than CFO, because I feel like we are much more exposed at the COO level, CEO level than we are the CFO level. And I think for us, it's more just the metrics that are most pertinent to them. So for our COO, operational waste is a net cost to the business. So every ton that we are sending to waste is hitting his kind of ledger. And so anything we can do to reduce that is a win. And so talking in that language is how we help. With the CHRO, where we, for example, are seen more favorably across the employee group as a more sustainable retailer, or one in which sort of supports local community, that helps with employee attraction and retention. So we look at those figures, and that's what I report on to her. A CEO is kind of the aggregate, but obviously ensuring that we are moving in the right direction. So we use the metric that is most relevant to that stakeholder, I would say.
Yeah, you need to be a bit of a chameleon in the sustainability space, that's for sure.
Yeah, I also think sometimes I think for businesses that are starting on this journey, there is the perception maybe that sustainability is always going to cost money. And if I look at, I think two things we did, we boxed our CFO into a corner, in the sense that when we made our first SBTi commitment, we published our short-term 5-year targets. So we kind of held ourselves accountable to hitting those. And without a doubt, that drove action across our business. We literally, we'd done the smaller projects that nudged the dial, but we needed to take on some bigger projects to hit our 2025 targets. We're to make a 33% reduction in scope 1 and 2. And we got there, but we piled projects in to our 4th year. So we did a massive solar expansion, but that had a 4-year payback, including canopies in the car parks that had longer paybacks. But the whole project was 4 years. CFO was on board with that. Our Boomerang project, that closed loop recycling system, that's effectively washed its face cost-wise. And now the EPR tax has come in, we've got an exemption from that. So that's actually now turned into a positive cash saving for us. Our vehicle fleet in Wiltshire Farm Foods, we can't electrify, or we don't know what the route is going to be for our HGV fleet at the moment. But we have smaller vehicles, about 400 of them, that are delivering into homes all across the UK. We went from 2 out of 400 vehicles to 75% of that network being electrified in the space of 12 months. Because we had this short-term target that kind of drove action. So I think we partly boxed the CFO into a corner because we'd made these commitments. And so how can we go out to the market now and say we're not going to do it? But I also think there's an awful lot of projects that you can get on with that are actually cost neutral. I'm not suggesting you can get the whole way to net zero with it being cost neutral, but you can make significant progress.
And this is where the current external operating environment, geopolitics, is very helpful for us. Increase fossil fuel prices really changed the business case for decarbonisation, for regen ag, potentially in terms of reduced fertilizer costs. So, yeah.
Our energy price has gone up 3 times in the last 3 years. And so the story that we tell the CHRO, Chief Real Estate Officer, is the installation we've made on solar. So now 12% of our store estate has solar installation, and that provides 25% of the energy use for that store. So that this year saved about 3 million. And so that is something that, it's not in any way going to cut the 3x that we've had on our overall energy, but it's a massive help to start talking the story of how we're putting money back into the business.
And tracking the data along the route and being able to quantify that is helpful to make sure you can feed back the stories of success to the finance team and the risk teams. All right, so we're going to move into our last section. It's short before we go into a Q&A. But we have one more Slido question. So what is driving the pressure for your businesses when setting your sustainability strategy? Is it investors, regulators, C-suite, consumers? And it may be different for different businesses, as we've heard on the panel today. What's driving your priority? And I think this probably migrated the pressures over the last couple of years as dynamics have changed. So still regulators are driving quite heavily, and consumers, followed by investors and C-suite. Okay, super interesting. So still lots of regulatory reporting going on. Okay, so we've talked a lot about internal alignment with customers. I did want to just hone in on the investor dialogue. And David, since Nomad Foods is publicly traded, what specific pressures or demands are you facing from your investor community and investor stakeholders by way of sustainability in this environment?
So this is a question that certainly since the Trump, and I'm not going to get into politics, but certainly since the Trump administration came in, there was this whole frenzy within the business and externally. Our ESG is dead. Investors don't care anymore. I can sort of say that that's certainly not the case. Yes, there's a reframing, one towards having an agenda that's far more commercially grounded and generating value, which I think is good, because for it to be sustainable, it needs to be integrated in the business and to deliver value. And the reason is, sustainability, climate nature risk represents trillions of dollars worth of financial risk to the economic market. I think nature risk alone is potentially 4 trillion globally, or something. You probably know figures better than I. And then sort of carbon risk is a sort of an equivalent. So you look at $10 to $15 trillion worth of impact. And when you look like, there are certain businesses that are more exposed to those impacts. Being food and bev, we are one of the most exposed. So if you're an investor, and particularly if you're more of a pension fund, that's more of a medium-term investor, and you're not looking at a quick return, you want to be putting your hundreds of billions worth of shareholdings into companies that properly understand climate and nature risks, that are really taking it seriously internally around what are the levers and interventions that they can pull to reduce exposure to that risk, flatten the peaks of volatility, reduce the impacts of volatility, in order to ensure that you don't have in the case of carbon, a stranded asset or a devaluation of your holding. So against that backdrop, I have seen, even now, several of our top 10 investors, all US based, have quite significant conversations with me around climate risk, nature risk, human rights, and what we're doing in the supply chain. One thing that has changed, however, is these conversations are getting far more meaningful. They're moving away from a tick box, do you have an SBTI? Tick. Through to, right, no. What are the most financial material areas are you focusing on? And what is the impact you're having to address that? So it's becoming far more like a P&L conversation around what are you actually doing beyond just reporting and having a commitment. And this is where I think, TCFD, TNFD, and there's a social one being discussed now, the task force, I think TISND or something.
Something like that.
So, the financial markets are understanding across the ESG range the risks, and they're creating the right frameworks in place for them to be able to compare apples with apples within their sort of portfolio offering. And that's, again, where the competitive advantage comes on as well. If you want to have greater share price stability and growth, you need to be managing these issues well to give investors confidence to put their money in.
Yeah, the conversation has definitely moved into value creation and protection kind of conversations.
Value at risk and cost of inaction.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we open up for some questions from the audience, any final kind of comments from the panelists today on ways that you're driving the conversation with your CFO office, or really honing in on the value creation opportunity available through these sustainability initiatives and your work?
I think just to say that I think sustainability gets quite a bad rep. I think we sort of often are having to fight the case that it's not just a net overall cost to the business. And I think that actually starts spinning kind of to the points that you've made of actually where you're making it cost neutral or even cost positive to the business, I think is massively important. So tools like Risilience, where you're able to kind of better visualize that, is helpful.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, sustainability is now no longer, in my view, a nice to have siloed comms related function, but rather something that is far more strategically valuable, that helps inform the strategy of the business. And if done effectively, sustainability will power the future growth and profitability of the business. And it's around how, and we're all in this transition now as we move from siloed comms teams through to more integrated functions, having a seat at the sort of table. We're just going through that transition around how do we better put financials and money and ROI around it to then mean that we can start allocating capital to drive the change, similar to any form of investment decision within the business.
It really elevates the narrative too for sustainability professionals to be able to have and dialogue with other departments around the business, understanding what pain points they have, what's important to them, how they succeed at their work, and how collectively the business succeeds together. So it's an upskilling of sorts. People need to understand sustainability, and sustainability leaders need to understand the business.
And I think for us, sometimes, the need for compliance drives that conversation as well. So we'll be a wave 2 company in CSRD, and my parent company in Germany, the finance team now are very interested in our sustainability data all of a sudden. I wouldn't say they've been that interested in the last few years, but they're worried about, okay, we've got a report at the end of 2027. Where's the data? What have you got? How robust is it? So okay, that's purely driven initially by compliance, but it then drives the ongoing conversations around those topics. So sometimes you can leverage compliance to drive value.
Absolutely.